Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here, and I thank you for watching. In this video I want to talk about the 18th century Scottish philosopher David Hume. David Hume, he has gone down as one of the greatest philosophers of all time. You have philosophers like Plato, Aristotle, and St. Thomas Aquinas, and René Descartes, and David Hume, who are really among the greats in the Western tradition of philosophy. There are a host of others who are great as well, but these are figures that you're likely to study in an intro to philosophy class due to their significance to the history of philosophy. So David Hume, 18th century Scottish philosopher, and he had a worldview, and his worldview, which I won't be able to capture nearly all of, will consist of thinking, will consist of theories about what exists, the nature of what exists, how we know what exists, if we in fact do know what exists, and also a theory of ethics, a theory of how we should live our lives, and how it is that we determine how we live our lives, etc. And so in this video I want to talk a bit about his worldview, and then segue to the topic of the enduring self, which Hume attacks in his philosophy. So it's just part of his worldview. David Hume was very critical of previous attempts to figure out and work out theories of what exists. He took issue with theories which were unempirical, is the way of putting it. Theories that didn't rely on sense experience to try to figure out what exists. So David Hume is a philosopher whose epistemology, his theory of knowledge, as it were, it really governs and guides his worldview. And David Hume goes down as one of the big three British empiricists. There's John Locke, there's David Hume, there's another figure named Bishop Berkeley. And Hume develops an empiricism, which is the theory that the way in which we come to know things is through our senses. That's sort of a loose way of putting it. Perhaps slightly more strict way of putting it is the view that all of our knowledge derives from sense experience. And David Hume would definitely agree with that. And so our knowledge regarding what exists is going to be governed by his empirical approach. And he thought that traditionally philosophers didn't properly develop a theory of what exists because they were not adhering to empirical standards. And so Hume goes even further, it seems, in his empirical approach to philosophy. He thinks that not only is it true that we can't know anything that goes beyond the senses or sense experience, but it's actually the fact that we can't even say anything meaningful unless what we say is grounded in sense experience. And so it turns out that what Hume would say is that much of the history of philosophy has been uttering gibberish, has been speaking about a lot of things that lack meaning, and thus many things that philosophers have said or have tried to say turn out to be meaningless on Hume's account. That's because many philosophers, when they try to figure out what exists, they rely on ideas, they rely on arguments that aren't empirically grounded. So just for a simple example, I know this is abstract, philosophers in the history of philosophy have tried to argue for God's existence, they've tried to argue for the immortality of the soul, and they've tried to argue for the existence of things like free will. And they'll often develop arguments that have nothing to do with thinking about empirical facts, citing empirical evidence, and he thinks that this is problematic. So when Hume tries to work out a theory of what exists, when he tries to theorize about God, for example, he thinks we need to be careful empiricists and think about the issue in terms of empirical evidence. And this leads to a kind of atheism about God. We have no good reason to think God exists because the evidence just isn't there. The relevant kind of evidence, or the only kind of evidence, the evidence that we gain through sense experience isn't there. And the same would be true for something like an immortal soul. There just is no evidence for that claim, so we have good reasons to be anti-realists about such a thing, based on the fact that, empirically speaking, we don't have grounds for thinking that such things exist. So his worldview challenges a lot of traditional philosophy, a lot of traditional metaphysics. That is, metaphysics is that part of philosophy that's concerned with figuring out what exists. So, so that's a bit about his worldview. The epistemology, his theory of knowledge, really drives his metaphysics, his theory of what exists. And he's someone who, as mentioned, just to kind of summarize what I've said here, his worldview of metaphysics would have it that there's no God and there's no immortal soul, for example. And the reasons for thinking that that's true is because there's no evidence for those things existing. Now, when it comes to his ethics, his ethics is often categorized as a kind of moral sentimentalism. A moral theory is a sentimentalist one when it bases our moral obligations on our feelings. So when we think about the term sentiments, or sentimentalism, we should be thinking about feelings. So he has a kind of view according to which moral feelings are the things that determine how we should act. Now there are competing interpretations of what Hume means by moral sentimentalism, but his view stands in stark contrast to views which would have it that our obligations are determined by, for example, God's commands. There are theories out there, moral theories out there, which would have it that that we can learn in certain biblical passages or scriptural passages commands that God gave us to guide us in our acting. Well, according to Hume, that view is false. It's our feelings that guide us in our acting and properly determine how we should act. Moreover, when we think about other kinds of views that aren't based on God, views according to which our morals are determined by our reason, gives us very firm facts like mathematical truths and logical truths. And so some philosophers think that it'd be handy if we could work out a theory of ethics which was based on reason, because reason does give us firm truths. And many philosophers think that that morality is the kind of thing that's so serious that it needs to have proper, firm foundations. I mean, we don't want it to be the case that that telling the truth, for example, as a moral obligation that we have, is a flimsy thing that can come and go depending on what our feelings are. So philosophers in the history of philosophy have tended to shy away from developing moral theories which would have it that our feelings determine what our obligations are, because feelings are fleeting, they're changing, and all the rest. So Hume, he's willing to adopt a line of thought according to which the way we should live is based on what our feelings are. Now, there's different ways of interpreting Hume on this point. Perhaps it's the feelings of a virtuous person that determine the way we should act. There's different accounts out there, but that's one that's out there. But key thing for Hume is that he's breaking with tradition in another kind of way. Before he breaks with the metaphysical tradition, the tradition of doing metaphysics in a non-empirical way, and then now here he is doing ethics in a non-traditional way. So David Hume came along and he did things in a very unconventional way, and he goes down as someone who challenged a lot of conventions and a lot of standard ways of doing things in the history of philosophy. Now, that just gives you a sense of his worldview. I want to just speak the rest of the time in this video, the next 5 minutes, on his argument against the enduring self. Now, what is the enduring self? Well, it's a view according to which at every time at which we exist, we're wholly present, we're wholly there. So if you go back to the time when you were 5 years old in kindergarten, the thought is that you were wholly there, and now think about yourself right in the present moment. You are wholly where you are now, and it's also true that at every intervening time, perhaps at every instant, you are wholly present at each of those times at which you exist. So the idea of an enduring self is the idea of a self that exists across time, even though change has been undergone. So in philosophy, we call this idea of persistence. We think that objects can undergo change, yet remain the same object. So we'll sometimes say things like objects can remain numerically the same in the sense that there's one and the same object that continues to exist across times, even though they undergo qualitative change. So there's qualitative differences, meaning that the thing that remains numerically identical is qualitatively distinct because the qualities have changed. So think about all the changes you've undergone from the time that you were in kindergarten to now. You've remained the same in some sense, but you've also changed. So you've differed. And philosophers, they want to account for this. And the common way in Hume's day, and perhaps to this day, is the idea that we persist, we exist across times, by enduring. We are wholly present at each time in which we exist, and we just undergo qualitative changes as we endure. So this is a prevalent view, and the competitor view, not in Hume's day, but in our day, to the endurance view is a view according to which you don't wholly exist at any time at which you exist, but rather a time slice of you exists at each time. A part of you, if you will, sometimes called a temporal part of you exists at each time at which you exist. And you are the sum of the time slices. You are the sum of the temporal parts, if you will. Now, Hume wasn't thinking about that view, but that's a view that rivals the view of enduring. Now, Hume was well aware of the fact that the enduring self was the common sense view, and he thought that we needed to have proper evidence for thinking that this view is true. The view that we're wholly present at each time in which we exist, that there is an underlying self that exists that undergoes change, and we could think about that in terms of experiences. The enduring self view is a view according to which we exist as a self, and we have experiences. These experiences, they come and they go, and one will happen, and then another will happen, and then another will happen. And so there's a succession of experiences that we go through. So there's an underlying self that has the experiences. Well, on Hume's view, given that he's an empiricist, he wants good evidence for it. And he searches for the evidence, and he says basically that there isn't any such evidence, because his empirical framework would have it that if there were evidence for there being an underlying self that has the experiences, we'd have an idea of that self. But when we look within, we find no such idea. All we find when we look within is the succession of experiences. One experience followed by another experience followed by another experience, but we never experience that underlying self which has the experience. Therefore, we have good reasons for rejecting it. So on Hume's view, we think about the self, we think about psychological connectedness instead. We have experiences which are psychologically connected to each other, but there's no underlying self that's there. So there just are the sum of experiences without there being an underlying self. Thank you for watching, everybody.